Trump has installed a fear in other nations' leaders that we're seeing play out in reaction to what's taking place in Venezuela, because whether or not you believe, Maduro should have been removed from the country, it doesn't really matter. It's the way that it was done and it's the implications afterward.
In the early hours of January the 3rd, the United States crossed a line many thought unthinkable: the extrajudicial capture of a sitting head of state. While the viral images of Nicolás Maduro being paraded through New York were the work of AI, the theatrics were all too real, as were the receipts from the Manhattan courtroom, a First Lady appearing before a judge with a black eye and a bandaged head, the unspoken evidence of that surgical extraction. Instantly, the familiar fig leaf narrative snapped into place. We're being sold a 21st century caricature, the madman in Caracas versus the reluctant liberator. It's a script that feels all too familiar for those who remember Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan. Frankly, the list goes on. But this time, the mask is off. Donald Trump isn't pretending this is about democracy. He's said it plainly, over and over. This is about the oil. And now he has Greenland in his sights too. This is the Donroe Doctrine, a blunt transactional imperialism that treats the rules-based order not as law, but as branding for empire. To help us cut through the chaos, I'm joined by a woman who has spent 2 decades inside the belly of the beast. She's a lawyer, the author of the Chavez Code, and a woman Hugo Chavez himself dubbed La Novia de Venezuela, the girlfriend of the revolution. Eva Golinger is no mere spectator. She is a self-described soldier for the revolution. She served as a strategic advisor to heads of state across Latin America, including 10 years at the right hand of Hugo Chavez himself. Armed with thousands of declassified CIA documents, she has made it her life's work to map the imperial web, exposing the invisible threads of funding and espionage Washington uses to pull the levers of power. Eva, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for being with us. So for people who may not be familiar with your personal story, take us through how it is that you visit Venezuela as a young woman in your 20s, and you end up eventually becoming a close advisor to the former Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez. How did that journey come about?
Yes, certainly not your typical story. Well, originally I went to Venezuela to explore family roots and spent a time there in the early 1990s. Actually, it was interesting because obviously I didn't know Hugo Chavez at that time, but when I arrived in Venezuela, he had just unsuccessfully led an attempted coup d'etat to overthrow a corrupt regime that was in place in 1992, and he was in prison. And so Venezuela was in the time period of an interim government when I first went there around 1993. And there were widespread protests throughout the country. And it was honestly, it was just a really fascinating look at, Latin American movements and that sort of rich social movement history in the region. And I wasn't in Caracas, I was in a city in the Andes Mountains called Merida. I ended up really just loving the country. And then after, over coming back to the US, I ended up deciding to just move back down to Venezuela. That was in the 90s. So, of course, again, Chavez was in prison this whole time. And essentially, I had a whole other life. Actually, I sang in a Latin jazz band and spent time writing about, the social movements and the protests and the dynamics there between the government and the uprisings taking place in the country. So when Chavez is released from power and from prison, excuse me, and this whole movement had been building throughout the time he was in prison around him, because there was a lot of people don't understand, because it's sort of been painted in the media that pre-Chavez everything was perfect in Venezuela, and it was like a bastion of wealth and quality of life. But that's actually not true. I mean, the entire reason that there was a movement that brought Chavez to power was precisely because poverty had expanded so dramatically throughout the country, and the middle class had essentially been wiped out. And so that's really what was happening. I mean, there was so much discontent. The protests were almost every day. And they were violent protests. I mean, interactions between a lot of students, younger people, and movements, with throwing rocks, and then there was exchange of tear gas. I mean, that, and the National Guard was a tool of the government. I mean, I'm talking in the 1990s, repressive. I remember being with friends, I was young in my early 20s, and any male friend at that time, Venezuela had a military draft, was subject to being taken off the streets if the National Guard decided to stop and ID them. And if they were of age, they would be taken right there. It happened to me with some of my friends. It was terrifying to see that's what was going on. So when Chavez was released from prison, the movement around him built even more, and then he was democratically elected. It was a total upset because nobody expected that this man who had a previous soldier who had led this attempted coup, had been in prison, who wasn't your sort of classically educated Venezuelan, would be elected president. There was the campaigns against him were insane in the media. There was so much like propaganda and misinformation to portray him in this horrific light. But when he wins the presidency, he runs on this platform of democracy, of popular democracy, eliminating the draft, eradicating poverty as much as possible, and implementing these widespread social reforms to, redistribute Venezuela's oil wealth, which Venezuela's, has the largest oil reserves in the world. And even though oil was nationalized not during Chavez in 1976, by the 90s, it was run like a private enterprise, and it really was profiting just the hands of the elite. I mean, that was essentially the main opposition to Chavez was the elite, the wealthy elite in Venezuela. I mean, it's been so many years, but it's hard to describe because you look at Venezuela and the majority of at that time. I mean, this is 20 some years ago, over 25 years ago. Really, the elite, the ones that opposed Chavez, were primarily, I mean, without exaggeration or stereotype, coming from this like upper class, ties to many European countries, to the United States, lighter skinned, would pass easily as white. Whereas the majority of the poor people, were darker skinned and living in, like impoverished, miserable conditions throughout the country. So I mean, this dichotomy was so severe.
And what was it about the Bolivarian project that drew you to it personally?
Having lived in Venezuela pre-Chavez, I lived in that time period. So I knew what it was like. I lived there for many years, and I knew the struggles that were going on with the people, and the discontent, and the inequalities, and the desire for change, and just the fact that in general people were disgruntled and disbelieved in the politics. They had a similar two-party system like the United States, that in fact had really been nurtured by the United States and based on the US model. And in the US, the same situation had been occurring amongst, people who were sort of opposed to the two traditional parties that just share power back and forth. And I was sort of coming out of that from my university years and looking into, social movements and change. So it caught my attention in that sense. But I had actually returned to the US when the band didn't work out and it wasn't paying the bills. And I was pursuing my law career, and that's when Chavez won. And so I followed what was happening. It was interesting, but initially there was a lot of skepticism because he had a military past, and a lot of people, especially on the left and those that sort of wanted change in the country, still were very skeptical of whether would he be authoritarian, would he be like a military ruler, or would he be a democratic ruler. And so as soon as things started to change, and they voted on and wrote this new constitution, there were all these human rights and social and political rights, things really started to change. It was fascinating to follow, but it really wasn't until, and I would go back and see, family. I had married at that time a Venezuelan, and so we would go back a lot. And then when there was a coup that took place against Chavez in April of 2002, and knowing everything that had built up to that point, and then seeing, and also at that time I was living in the US again, and seeing it play out on US media, but knowing the reality in the country, it was so apparent that that the U.S. was in cahoots with the Venezuelan opposition to overthrow Chavez. That it was just the like classic playbook of what the U.S. had done in Latin America for like the previous 50 years. And here I was witnessing it as someone who I knew it on the inside as well as the outside. So that particular coup against Chavez, which ended up failing after 72 hours and he was brought back to power. When it played out though on the media, particularly international media like CNN and all throughout the US, including on Venezuelan private media at that time, it was like this rapid recognition of this coup government. I mean, it was just such a classic like coup d'etat out of power. The U.S. immediately recognizes the coup leader, and everything's fine and dandy. And now democracy's back. I mean, it was so crazy, and so I felt compelled, like, to be pulled into that, and something compelled me that I couldn't let this stand. This disinformation campaign, this apparent and obvious like role of the United States. To me, I just felt like I had to do something.
And of course, we're not here principally to talk about Chavez, but I am curious very briefly now, because you obviously mentioned that he ushered in an era where there was sort of human rights and a sort of a promise of a new Venezuela. Looking back today, do you have any sort of caveats perhaps to the optimism you felt? Obviously he was a military leader and there were forms of repression that did ensue. Do you have any caveats to kind of the optimism you had?
Well, here's the thing. The movement and his government, as it built up and began implementing policies, was widely successful. They had huge achievements, eradication of almost 80% poverty in the country. I mean, people were brought out of these miserable, impoverished conditions. He built up with, this government that he created, very efficient and effective at that time period. Education systems, free universal health care, free education, widespread like access to government institutions, democratization at that level, bringing people who previously had been alienated and marginalized into the political process, which was one of the number one achievements of the Chavez government, was precisely incrementing political participation and making people feel from all different sectors of society that they had a place, that they had a role, that they had a voice. And then, of course, one of his overarching goals, which is just a tragedy in terms of seeing what's playing out now, was ensuring the sovereignty and independence of Venezuela and turning Venezuela into this regional power. And so he built up, as his movement inside grew and was successful, using the oil wealth, he built up all these multilateral relationships around the world, created entire regional entities that unified South America, that unified Latin America and the Caribbean. I mean, these were all achievements of Chavez, enormous achievements that pretty much everything has now been destroyed. I mean, that's the total tragedy of this entire story. But yeah, I mean, I would say the number one mistake was the entrenchment in power. That one of the biggest lessons that I learned was that no one should have the opportunity to remain in power. There should never be an elimination of term limits. And that did take place in Venezuela. It was voted on by the people in a referendum legitimately. Venezuela had very fraud proof elections at that time period, and they were backed by international observers. So all of that is completely legitimate. There was a constitutional amendment that eradicated term limits. And in the end, that turns out to have been a huge mistake, because what that did was also enable Chavez to believe that he would continue as the leader of that government, of his project. I mean, it really was not just a government, it's like a whole movement and system transformed the country in that time period. And so there wasn't, even though there were other political figures that could have been nurtured to assume positions of leadership, they were always sort of suppressed, of never being able to reach that potential, because Chavez was there. And Chavez was an incredibly magnetic and charismatic person. I mean, there's no question of that. I traveled with him around the world. I saw grown men cry in his presence just by touching him. I mean, he had that effect on people. I mean, that's just who he was. That's why he was such a controversial, loved and hated figure, and a leader, and considered, one of the most influential figures in Latin American history.
For those in Europe, some people might be watching current events unfolding, thinking that Trump's recent obsession with Venezuela is a little left field. But actually, for someone like yourself who's been involved in advising on international relations between the US and Venezuela for over 2 decades, it's not quite as left field as it might appear, right? So is taking over Venezuela a new year, new Trump, or has this perhaps been on the horizon a little bit longer than a sort of this idea that Trump suddenly taken another one of his rash decisions?
This has been a U.S. policy. It's not a Trump policy. Trump has achieved it. As difficult as it is to give him another victory on another notch on his wins, he has achieved what no previous US government was able to do in the past 25 years. I mean, Chavez used to say, and he told me also in different moments, that in meetings when he was first elected, before he even assumed the presidency, was sworn in, he was told by the US government at the time that they wanted him to come in under their wing and continue as other Venezuelan governments had done before, which was to be really compliant with US interests and US policies. And Chavez refused. It wasn't that he was originally defiant and was seeking a rupture in relations. He wanted Venezuela to be independent and sovereign, which is the right of every nation in the world. And so it's just that Venezuela had essentially been a client state of the United States for so many years. So this is not like some new policy. I mean, for the past 25 years, the United States has been undermining the Venezuelan governments from the time of Chavez throughout Maduro. I mean, unfortunately, the Maduro government ended up destroying most of Chavez's legacy and made it so much easier for there to be, widespread support to remove him from power.
Let's pull out from Venezuela for a quick second. And can you paint us a picture a little bit more around the region and around perhaps what the implications are for the region of this US takeover, as it's being branded, of Venezuela in relation specifically to this notion of sovereignty? Latin America, for those who are not familiar with it, has long been an area of resistance to US imperialism and has been, in the case of Cuba and others, punished extensively for that. So what does this fall of Venezuela, what does this takeover of Venezuela by the US have in terms of wider regional implications for exactly that?
Oh, it's a massive blow. It's huge. I mean, sure, there's been resistance and a anti-imperialism throughout Latin America for all of history, essentially, from the time of the Monroe Doctrine as it came into place, where the United States has treated Latin America as its backyard, and it sort of has ebbed and flowed over the years, as the U.S. hand got the iron fist of the United States, supported dictatorships, coups d'etats, all kinds of, regime change efforts that resulted in civil wars and repressive governments and brutal dictatorships. I mean, Pinochet in Chile, for example. I mean, the history of the United States interventions in Latin America is just never ending. So this is not something that's new. What was dramatically different was that when Hugo Chavez was elected and throughout the first decade, really, of his presidency, or really from the time of the coup to about 2010 or 2011, 2010 or 11, there was this period, a tide throughout all of the region where you had almost a majority of leftist leaning governments in place, all of whom supported this united Latin American and South American front in defense of the United States. I mean, it was truly a historic, incredible moment. I was actually there with Chavez. It was one of my first trips with him in 2004, I want to say, yeah. We went to Cusco, Peru, and it was the first meetings of what eventually became the community of Latin American and Caribbean states, and what became also UNASUR, which is the Union of South American Nations. It was the first time that these heads of state had grouped together to discuss the rebuilding of their region free of the influence of the United States and on the terms of the region. And so they were trying to really become a bloc, like a regional bloc, so that they could confront US power and influence, because obviously the US has tremendous power and has wanted Latin America under its wing. And so, and then we saw like a more lenient stance during the Obama administration. That's not to say that it wasn't equally as interventionist in the region, but it was on sort of different terms. And there was sort of a more openness to allow for countries to exercise their regional sovereignty. Of course, there was always, Cuba being the exception, because the blockade against Cuba has remained in place now for, 60 years that it's been in place. So, I mean, so really, yeah, the question of sovereignty is a critical one at this time, as we're seeing a United States president, Donald Trump, who has authoritarian tendencies, if not tyrannical. And they're not just in terms of exercising his authority in the US over the US people, which he's also doing here, in terms of, using the military against the people and eradicating some fundamental rights and, scaring people and giving like an air of censorship in the country, lack of freedoms. Look at what's happening with the media in the United States. The Trump government is essentially taking over media. So, yeah, I mean, I think that this is a very scary moment, because as we see the rise of certain strongmen in the world that are trying to exercise their control over their areas of influence, Trump is sort of leading the effort in that, and sovereignty. It seems as though Trump has installed a fear in other nations' leaders that we're seeing play out in reaction to what's taking place in Venezuela. Because whether or not you believe, Maduro should have been removed from the country, it doesn't really matter. It's the way that it was done, and it's the implications afterward that now Trump is saying he's going to run the country. I mean, imagine he could then do that anywhere he wants if there's no pushback.
So let me ask you about the media for just a second, because you specifically pointed to an argument that's obviously being recycled on almost every network at this point, which is this idea that actually many Venezuelans are celebrating Maduro's as being removed from power. There's a poll that was published in Newsweek showing that a majority in Latin America support his ouster, as do 1 in 3 Americans. Trump himself has justified the capture as part of a regime change that the US wants to enact because, Venezuelans wanted him gone. To what extent do you think there can be any legitimacy given to the argument that Maduro had to go? That whether Trump was responsible or anybody else, this was a necessary removal?
The circumstances under which it occurred can never be justified. Simply, the US invaded Venezuela. I mean, that's what it is. They can use whatever language they want to cover that up. They used a military force to invade the sovereign territory of Venezuela to extract Maduro and his wife from their home and take them extrajudicially outside of the country to stand trial in the United States. So, yes, was there an indictment in the United States, a legal process that existed? Absolutely. But that doesn't apply across borders. So if Maduro had been detained in the United States during a visit, or even in another country that maybe had an agreement with the US, an extradition agreement, that would have played out legally. This was not. So trying to justify it under, oh, well, it's good because he was a bad guy. The precedent is just unacceptable, because again, it opens the door to not just Trump doing it again, but other leaders could do it. Putin could do it. Xi Jinping could do it. Anyone could justify then, oh, all I have to do is build a court case in our country against someone in another country, and then we can just go get them. We don't need permission. So, I mean, that's what's scary, is that it's not, yes, I understand that a lot of people are happy that Maduro's gone, but that would make more sense if Trump then didn't leave the entire government apparatus in place in Venezuela.
And also, let's be honest, there are a lot of people celebrating with Saddam was, killed by the US during the invasion of Iraq, and that lasted a hot minute before people quickly realized what was actually going on. But speaking of the existing political apparatus in Venezuela, I'm a little confused, and maybe you can help me understand why it was necessary to kidnap the president. Because my understanding is that Maduro's was actually pretty compliant, and that actually when we look at, what's happened since, obviously the vice president, Delcy Rodríguez, has now been sworn in as acting president. She has served as a right-wing woman to Maduro, working for his government, since 2013. Her brother, Jorge Rodríguez, is also a senior government official. He's serving as the head of Venezuela's National Assembly. How much on the ground has actually changed since Maduro was plucked from his bed?
Well, what's changed is that now it's much more repressive because there will be no tolerance of any kind of dissent, of anyone questioning the new regime. They're implementing basically a facade saying that, that this is necessary for the continuation of the revolution, if you could even call it that anymore. I mean, that's a fallacy essentially at this point. But nothing's changed in terms of the corrupt structure that's been left in place, because that's the tragedy of what happened, is that Chavez was elected democratically. He built up a widely admired social system in the country, that had huge achievements, as we already talked about, in terms of, you know, poverty elimination and widespread like social and economic rights in the country. And his death, which was tragic and unexpected, left, this void. And it was filled by Maduro, who he chose as his successor precisely because they never prepared for another leadership to take place because of the entrenchment in power. And then Maduro, of course, in his first year, he was elected. He was democratically elected initially as president. Venezuela had a fraud proof electoral system before they trashed it last year, but it really did. I mean, there was discontent in the country and opposition, and certainly the opposition, political opposition, was emboldened by Chavez's death, and they saw an opening. And I mean, why wouldn't they? This was their chance to come back. So when Maduro won, that opposition built up. And the unfortunate circumstance of Maduro's presidency was that oil fell, the price of oil fell. And so they lost this whole economy that had sustained all of the advances in the country, and the economic stability, and that all was gone. And then they implemented all kinds of ineffective and economic policies that led the country to the state that it's at today, and corruption spread rampantly. And in order to retain power over time, that's what happened, was these sort of groups that controlled different aspects of the Venezuelan system and government banded together, pacted together to support Maduro essentially as the face of the government, but in order to retain power. And then, of course, they retain power at any cost, including, the election that took place in 2024, which was the results were never shown, which to me says everything, because the system is so fraud proof. If you don't show the results, it most likely means you lost and don't want to show them, but they retain power anyway. And that's because there's an overarching belief of, this is our sovereign destiny, our right. I mean, we even hear language, religious language, all kinds of things. God put me here, whatever. And so they're refusing to leave power, because relinquishing power means losing everything that they've worked for and built up, but also wealth that's been accumulated through widespread corruption. And so by removing Maduro, and the other, Delcy Rodríguez takes place, who was vice president, takes place in the presidency, it's essentially a continuation of the same regime, except that now it does appear that they made a deal, with Trump to do Trump's bidding.
Well, so here's my question. Why did the US need to decapitate the Venezuelan government to get access to the oil? Are we saying, obviously the accusation that's being landed is that Maduro was running a drug cartel, and I'd love for you to comment on that. But if we take as perhaps a given that this is somewhat a smokescreen, why was this necessary? Are we suggesting that America was unable to access Venezuelan oil without decapitating the country? What is this all about, really?
The US was already accessing Venezuelan oil. One of the biggest trade partners was the US oil company Chevron. They have a huge stake in Venezuelan oil. I mean, and that's never stopped throughout this entire period. So mostly that argument is also, it's just not substantiated by reality. I think it comes down to more political theater in the sense of, the image of Maduro was sort of demonized, and I mean, he was responsible for the destruction of Venezuela's economy. I mean, as the head of state, and for widespread repression that's taken place in the country. I mean, I can't go back to I couldn't go back after I had disagreements with them. I was critical over some of the decisions that he made when he usurped the parliament, Venezuela's National Assembly, because the opposition had won a majority and was going to implement certain laws that he didn't like, and I spoke out about it, against it, and that got me, labeled as a traitor. I mean, that's ridiculous. So that, I mean, that kind of behavior also led to his own demise and demonization. But at the same time, yeah, I mean, look, all of these excuses were just a pretext to be able to achieve what the US wanted all along. And yes, Maduro had been negotiating and had already offered to open up even more and more. But honestly, I think by then it was too late, because there were factions within the US government, primarily Marco Rubio, who for so long have just wanted, to have a victory in the region, remove the Venezuelan government, remove Maduro from power. It all they know they know quite well that this isn't all about Nicolas Maduro, that it's part of an entire system, which is why it appears that they were negotiating early on with Rodriguez and her brother to, come to terms and into an agreement that should Maduro be removed, that they would take power and work with the United States. I mean, yes, there were already these deals going on. The whole drug trafficking thing. I mean, Venezuela doesn't produce any drugs. The drug trafficking is not a big business in Venezuela, but it does flow through there from neighboring countries like Colombia, where it's primarily produced, in Ecuador. But this whole cartel de los soles, I mean, it's not a real thing. It's just about the corruption amongst, like, the military, the generals who wear suns on their, it's like their patches for their, like, the stars in the United States, they're stars. In Venezuela, they're the shape of suns. So it was just sort of a name for, like, corrupted generals that were allowing the flow of drugs to happen at the border with Colombia, and pocketing I mean, it's about corruption. But was Nicolas Maduro a drug kingpin? I don't think the evidence is going to show that whatsoever. So it was all like a pretext to demonize him and then justify his removal. But I honestly don't think it would have gotten to this point and happened if the Trump administration wasn't entirely certain that they would have an alternative ready, willing, and able to step in. And they knew that that was not going to be the opposition led by Maria Corina Machado, because that opposition, and her particularly, did not command the control over the security forces and military in Venezuela. And so without that, there would be, widespread unrest and potential civil war.
Why did they need that? Why could that not have happened? With Maduro still in power, why did it need to happen? Why now? Because, of course, to your point about this not actually being about narco terrorism, it's almost as if, narco is the, 2026 version of the WMD's story that we had over Iraq, right? But and of course, it was just a few months ago that Trump pardoned the ex-Honduras President Juan Hernandez after he was charged with crimes related to drug trafficking. Let's not forget. But my question is, why was it necessary to get rid of somebody who arguably could have been made to do what the Americans needed him to do? Why now?
It's probably likely that Maduro wouldn't have been as complicit as the current government is, led by Delcy and her brother.
So what are they offering that he wouldn't?
They've completely subordinated the country to Trump. So, I mean, essentially, they're offering everything. I think the negotiation, I'm not privy to what exactly was said amongst them, but I can imagine with Maduro being sort of the standard bearer carrying on the, legacy of Chavez and whatever, still believing that probably still wanted to have control over the country and sovereignty. So it would have been, there would have been, he would have wanted to have been treated on equal terms. Um, but at the same time, I mean, there's so much more going on there. There's performative aspects. You know, I think Donald Trump governs on social media and is impulsive, whimsical, and entirely, focused on. He's narcissistic. So the fact that Maduro began taunting him. And Trump saw it, and Maduro's dancing, and they're creating this song, war, no war, peace, whatever. That really, I mean, Donald Trump wants to project an image of strength. He has a serious, complex. He is a very insecure person needing to exercise that all the time.
So, okay, so are you saying that Trump kidnapped the president of Venezuela because his ego was hurt over a video of Maduro dancing, taunting him? I mean, I'm not saying it's impossible, but I also want to ask you about that in the context of the US now announcing that it plans to be in Venezuela for the foreseeable. Like, is this just about oil? Is there something else going on in terms of long-term, control? We're also obviously hearing about Greenland. I heard somebody speculating that really what Trump wants to do is be the first president to expand US territory for the first time, right? Since the Monroe Doctrine, the Donroe Doctrine, as it would be rebranded now, would be he would go down as the first president to actually grow the American territory. What is this idea of remaining in Venezuela actually about?
Well, first of all, Donald Trump is known. I mean, this is what he does. This is what he's done his entire life: is expanded his presence and branded his name on everything. It's really all about his brand and him. That's how he sees the presidency as a business. This is. I mean, I'm from New York. This is where Trump is from. We had Trump. We have Trump everywhere in New York. Trump, 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 Trump golf courses. Trump on the highway, Trump signs saying he owns this piece of the highway, Trump buildings, Trump towers, Trump apartments, Trump everything. So this is who he is. And it's just literally no difference that he's now in the presidency, except that now he can do it all around the world. He's not interested in Venezuela and Venezuela's democracy or Venezuela's history or Venezuela's culture. He has zero interest in that. Venezuela was sold to him as an easy win for him by Marco Rubio, who long has wanted, not just Maduro out of power, but to go after Cuba. And they see Venezuela as an entry point to Cuba.
How?
And
Why?
these are long, like nostalgic, resentments that they have and believe that, is their right to go into these countries and overthrow their governments and take them back in the name of, democracy, I guess. But it's farcical. I mean, in the end, you could say, sure, maybe there's drug trafficking flowing through Venezuela. Yeah, the government was repressive and undemocratic. And I mean, all those things can be true. And at the same time, there can still be no justification for the US to do what it did, because that you could say that about many countries around the world where the US has fantastic relation. I mean, Donald Trump just invited into the Oval Office a former Al Qaeda leader who's now heading Syria. I mean, he talks about love letters with Kim Jong-un. I mean, come on. This is not in There's nothing here that's about anything related to like building democracy. So going in long term to Venezuela, why are they talking about it now? Because what they've done, because there was no alternative. I mean, this was not well thought through. I bet they didn't think that it would actually happen, that they would actually achieve the goal. That it all happened so fast. Not on the military side and the intelligence. I mean, separating that from like the Trump government, the US military and the special ops team and CIA are incredibly effective at what they do. They're well trained, and that's what they do. If they're given a mission, they're going to execute it to the best of their ability, which is what they did in this case. So, I mean, that's separate. But they weren't 100% sure they would be successful. Maduro had some tight prepared security. And as I understand it from the evidence and stories that have come out, is that they were on the verge of getting into their safe room when the US special forces entered and slaughtered the entire presidential security team and captured them. But this wasn't like thought out, like, oh, what do we do after that? That's why, I mean, I do think they wouldn't have acted in this way if they weren't certain they had someone to step into the void and act, in the interim, at least in US interests, which is, but now it's beyond their wildest dreams. They've now got the same sort of system in place, but completely complicit with US interests. And so I don't know how much of what Trump's saying is bluster in terms of, we're going to be there for so long, we're going to run it. But the truth of the matter is that the oil industry in Venezuela is in disarray. So if they want US companies to be able to go and invest and be present in Venezuela, there is a new infrastructure that needs to be rebuilt and built up. Security, that needs to be guaranteed. I mean, there's no US company that besides Chevron that's going to go in there right now and bring personnel and feel safe inside of Venezuela under these circumstances. So, this is going to be a long-term intervention in Venezuela if that's what Trump is seeking to do.
And the long-term intervention has what goal exactly, as far as you can see? Or you're saying you don't think it's been thought through that far? Because obviously, as you mentioned earlier, biggest oil reserves in the country. We know that obviously oil reserves globally are dwindling. We've got a few more decades ahead of us of the big burn of the fossil fuels. But of course, it's a race to the bottom of the barrel at this point. Is this about securing long-term energy security for Americans, one of three of whom apparently support what was just done?
I'm sure that's a key piece of it. Of course, Venezuela has not just oil reserves; they've got gold, there's aluminum, there's all kinds of heavy metals, there's rare earths. I mean, it's a port, it's a geostrategic location that's critically important for U.S. interests if they want to exert control over this hemisphere in the way as they did in times past. So it's always been. That's why it's not just about like just the oil I mean, I don't think they care which government is in place as long as it's going to be compliant with what the United States wants to do. And I'm sure there's probably so much scrambling going on. I mean, we've seen now all of a sudden Marco Rubio's come out with his 3-point plan to go in and get the oil, sell the oil, then start to rebuild the oil industry in Venezuela, and then eventually a transition to what? I mean, it seems to me that again they're going to be miscalculating what's going to go on internally in Venezuela, because while this government in place right now may be compliant with the Trump administration, it's hard to imagine that being the case in the long term amongst the people. It's like the history will just repeat itself again, and it'll give rise to another anti-American leader or anti-imperial, because Chavez wasn't anti-American, but he was anti-imperialist, and it will give rise to another leader. I mean, it literally is the same story over and over again.
It's going to be more insurgencies like we saw in Iraq, no doubt, too. Let me ask you about something. So the Harvard Review reported that the US attempted regime change in Latin America 41 times between 1898 and 1994. We could argue that, what Trump is doing in many ways isn't new, given that fact that actually regime change is a feature of US foreign policy. What is distinct about what he's just done? Is it just the theatrics?
What's distinct is that it's overt, that he's not trying to conceal it. Almost all of the interventions led by the US in Latin America have been done covertly through CIA, or and then there's been the recognition afterward and the work. But this is just all out in the open. He's just laid out all the cards and said, this is what we're doing, we're going in, we own it, we're going to run it. I mean, that is the brute reality with Donald Trump, is you get what you see. What you see is what you get. He's telling you, so believe him. I mean, he does lie. He does lie a lot, and he exaggerates. But in this case, he followed through on his word. I mean, he couldn't have done it obviously without the entire support of the massive military and intelligence apparatus of the United States and the pushing of Marco Rubio to this point. And again, the complicity on the other side in Venezuela of Rodriguez and those who've remained in power. Not it wouldn't have been successful to this point, but this is days in still. I mean, doesn't mean it's going to sustain. There's still so much unknown.
The timing is also so interesting, right? So we're talking about the same week where I believe Congress was supposed to reveal additional sources related to the Epstein files, which have also shown testimony that implicate President Donald Trump in the alleged rape of a minor, right, a 12-year-old, and the alleged complicity in the murder and disposal of a baby. These are very serious accusations, and all of them seem to be drowned out in the fanfare of this sort of American win as it's being presented by the administration. I want to ask you about the role of the theatrics. I mean, you're obviously based in the US. To what extent is the theatrics, as you described, what makes this distinct is that it's out in the open. And there's a big debate over whether this out in the open theatrics is just the bare face of US imperialism as it has always operated, or whether this is symptomatic of a more erratic form of power that maybe is indicative of an empire in decline. We know that, for example, over the past few years, China has become a huge trading partner across Latin America, second only, in fact, to the US. And there are reports that the Trump administration basically told Venezuela that if you want any kind of deal, you've got to cut ties with China, Russia, Iran, and Cuba and agree to an almost exclusive deal with the US. Do you think that there is something in what we're seeing here that speaks to where the US empire stands in terms of its historical trajectory, and how much credence do you give to these claims that this is related to kind of competing powers in the region trying to secure their interests and America trying to force its position?
First of all, this is standard US state policy, foreign policy. So a lot of this is not, Donald Trump is not interested in any of the depth of the history or the situation and what's at stake with Venezuela. The performative aspect of it is who he is. So I don't think any of that is a show or is covering up or a psyops campaign on his part. Because that's how he is with everything. Are they trying to cover up other things potentially, like Epstein files and Trump's implication? Absolutely. And there's also a variety of other issues going on inside the United States. There's a massive affordability crisis. We have a healthcare crisis that's quite severe. Trump is hugely unpopular. There's widespread, growing repression in the country. I mean, he's using the National Guard in the United States against his own people. We've got the whole issue with the violent persecution of immigrants in the United States. I mean, and I mean, it's a pretty dire situation internally in the U.S. that, of course, any distraction externally will help, because that's a standard classic tactic of a strongman, is create sort of a foreign war. Right? I mean, it's like the wag the dog or whatever that will unify the country, because of course you've all got to back your country and be patriotic and loyal if you're at war with another country or if the national security is threatened. So I mean, there's part of that is the distraction tactic. But yeah, I mean, the other side of it is, sure, Trump has his vision that he wants to be seen as more powerful than everybody else. He loves the strong men. He wants to be seen as a strong man. So absolutely. I mean, would he like to sideline Putin and China? out of this region? Yes, I mean, it came out in their national security strategy at the end of 2025. But did Trump write that? No. It's a team of, very hawkish neocons that are in his government that have been salivating over this opportunity for decades. And so they've just found in Trump the vessel to be able to achieve, this goal of expanding US empire, I guess, if you want to say, in the region, because they're not even looking beyond. I mean, they're looking at Greenland because Trump believes, it's close enough, it should be ours, but they're not looking in other parts of the world beyond the reach, of the United States at this time. It's not to say that he wouldn't eventually at some point.
We have heard Trump threatening Colombia's president, Gustavo Petro, and accusing him of drug trafficking and actually warning him to watch his ass, even though there's no evidence that Petro himself is involved in any narcotics trafficking. Where is the resistance to all of this going to come from, Ava? Because it doesn't look like the international community is prepared to stand up to Trump. I don't see any evidence so far, and I'd love to hear if you do, of the international community kind of coming together and saying, well, the implications of this for international law, security. We've seen Russia sort of getting involved today with issuing a warning against America's seizure of the oil tanks. I mean, we can sort of sit here and sort of semi-laugh at Trump's whimsical and erratic strategies, but these strategies have enormous implications, starting with Venezuela in this case. We could go to Gaza as another, but they could get much, much, much more serious. Who is going to stand up to Trump? How does the international community resist this moment, uphold what has historically been the only basis upon which to maintain the very, very fragile peace that we've been enjoying since the Second World War?
Yeah, well, Trump and the government that he's constructed around him of these loyalists who are not now on this second term are not the standard establishment Republicans that were with him on the first term that sort of kept him in check. These are no holds barred. I mean, they just announced, the Trump administration has pulled the United States out of over 60 international organizations. Trump has absolute disdain for the United Nations. The US is not even party to most agreements that would hold it accountable for absolutely anything. And in any case, international law is entirely an honor based system. So there's no method of enforcement if you're one of the powerful countries like the United States. So it's literally impossible for anyone to try to hold Trump to account on the international level. The U.S. isn't party to the International Criminal Court, even though they helped build and design the entire structure of the court, but they won't subject themselves to its jurisdiction. So it really comes down to the decisions made by nations and by regional bodies, and of course internally in the United States. I mean, right now the Republicans have control over the entire government. They have a majority in the Supreme Court, they have a majority in both houses of Congress, and they have the presidency. But we do have elections this year, legislative, and that could change the balance of power. But to be honest, I mean, what's it going to do? Because in the end, we haven't even seen the Democratic Party stand up enough to Trump yet this year. There's a lot of rhetoric, but there's been no concrete actions. We haven't seen enough of pushback from anybody in any kind of concrete way. But a lot of it is because people fear him. They fear him not because just now that we've seen he will use the might of the US military at his whim, but also because he uses his mass media power to destroy people, to crush them, to bring his supporters, fanatical supporters, to go after them violently. I mean, to harass people. I mean, he's created this climate of hate and violence and fear in the United States that's made it, very difficult for there to be a cohesive movement. I mean, in many ways, I don't think Trump is some like astute political operator and who's mapped this all out, but it's like the dream of any counterinsurgency operation I mean, to go against like how to control your own population and crush dissent and ensure that, while we remain the facade of a democracy. I mean, that's essentially what's happening inside of the US. So I think it's scary times for the world because, again, what Trump is doing in Venezuela is setting a precedent for the world for is it basically it's a no man's land. I mean, it's cowboy territory.
Where are America's checks and balances at this point, Ava? America has long been touted as one of the greatest democracies in the world. How can one man just come along and not just act like a cowboy domestically, but clearly a cowboy when it comes to wrecking the entire very fragile global order? Was American democracy in tatters before he arrived? I mean, what's gone wrong here?
He's enabled by those who follow him. I have to say that it's odd for me because having been a part of a movement that was led by a strongman, I understand the dynamics of when you're amongst that, the sort of seduction of it and the cultish aspects of it. And I'm living that now in the United States. It's literally a cult. Those who back Trump, they see no wrong. They enable him. They are charmed by him, as hard as that is to believe when you're not, when you're on the outside of that. So yeah, I mean, I think that there's right now he's operating with no bounds. I mean, and part of it is because of the fear that now he has installed in anyone. If you betray him, he will go after you. Look what he's done to that Congresswoman, Marjorie Taylor Greene, who dared speak out. I mean, she's not a leftist. I mean, she was a hardcore MAGA Trump supporter, but she's telling the truth. And now she's come out of the cloud is lifted. She's out of the cult. So she sees, but so many are still immersed in that, and they're in the highest positions of power. I mean, the last bastion in the United States, sort of check and balance on Trump, has been the courts, and the more that the U.S. Supreme Court has become controlled by his people, by people he's put there and who are willing to do his bidding, that is terrifying times because I saw in Venezuela how institutions were essentially destroyed and how even if it was at that time for the greater good of the movement and seeing how, well, this is a necessary thing to do so that we can ensure that our policies are implemented. Yeah, what that ends up being is that the institutions have been so weakened that they no longer really have any power or standing. And so, I mean, that's what happened in Venezuela. I do see that the United States is on that slippery slope. I mean, that rapidly, actually, and it's a scary moment.
My last question to you, Ava, has to do with the global resistance movement. The idea that, Latin America has had, as we discussed, a long history of anti-imperialism. Cuba's been severely punished for it. In the Middle East, we had what was long called an axis of resistance, which has been completely dismantled, obviously, through the invasion of Syria or the liberation of Syria, however you wish to dub that. And I know that there were competing analyses of what happened in Syria, and there will continue to be. Where in the world, and I literally mean in the global, from a global perspective, do you see any hope for what was once the non-aligned movement or, movements from the global south able to come together in view of trying to at least establish sovereignty or protection from these imperial powers? I know a lot of people point to the BRICS, but the BRICS also, include China and Brazil, which is not exactly what I would now consider to be liberatory politics. Where are you getting hope at all today when you look at the global stage with regards to, freedom for countries beyond the control of empire, whether it's American empire, Chinese, Russian?
I think history is what we have to look at. Just as we're seeing this uprising once again and takeover of, empire and this kind of repressive sort of far right movement, authoritarian. History has shown it goes in waves. It doesn't, just because they're in power today doesn't mean that they'll be in power tomorrow. History has shown that movements need to take their time and leaders will emerge. And I do believe that that will happen in Venezuela, because it's impossible that it wouldn't. It's happened all throughout history. I mean, before Chavez wasn't there, but before him there were others, and there was Simon Bolivar. But it took years, it took decades in order to create another similar type of liberating figure for the country. That's what Hugo Chavez was seen as. And hopefully it won't take another century, but it will take time. I mean, to rebuild. Right now, there's been a shift to authoritarianism around the world, to strongman governments and to right-wing governments, and the global balance of power is being, recreated at this moment. So much is changing. I mean, it literally it's unknown times, but I would always rest in history by looking back and learning from the past and knowing that without a doubt, movements will be rebuilt. People will come together, and I mean, a new vanguard will be born, because that's just precisely how it's always been, and that's how our societies have consistently behaved throughout history. I mean, it's a completely different era that we're embarking on with AI and this whole new world. Scary, especially for those of us who are older, who didn't grow up in this type of circumstance, but there's so many more opportunities, I think, for there to be different types of rebellion and resistance in a digital world. I mean, and so I do think I do profoundly believe I would never lose hope in that part of humanity. We can see the despots always coming and going, but they will go. They will.
Thank you for joining us. If this episode sparked some reflections, please share them in the comments below. To keep up to date with everything the tea, subscribe now to our YouTube channel and follow us on Instagram and TikTok. The links are in our bio. And if you love what we do and want more, join us on Patreon. You'll enjoy ad-free episodes, exclusive bonus content, and have an opportunity to shape what comes next. Until next time, stay awake, and we'll be back soon with more tea.